We collect 9 cents of every tax dollar. Like, that's never made any sense. It didn't even make sense at Confederation. It really doesn't make sense now, and it hasn't changed since then.
Since President Donald Trump started threatening tariffs on Canada, municipalities have been facing economic uncertainty. While workers and businesses are feeling the brunt, could this give them the opportunity to find new trading partners? Could our economies become more resilient and self-reliant? Here to discuss, Matti, Siemiatycki, Professor of Geography and Planning and Director of the Infrastructure Institute at the University of Toronto, Matt Siscoe, Mayor of St. Catharines, and Tony Stillo, Director of Canada Economics at Oxford Economics. Please, a round of applause. All right, Tony, I'm going to start with you. You've worked with AMO to come up with a report on how tariffs will affect municipalities. Hard truth. What are we looking at here?
Well, we think that the trade war has induced the start of a recession in Canada, and it boils right down to the municipalities, and it affects them differentially depending on their exposure to the U.S. economy and the trade dependency. And so it's going to affect cross-country, we think mainly in those trade-dependent areas, but it could broaden to a deeper recession depending on how stiff these tariffs are and how hard it hits that trade-dependent area. And that's largely manufacturing in Ontario, and you think of cities like Windsor, St. Catharines, you know, on the steel side, Hamilton, and up north, and various other cities with mining and of steel and such. So yes, it's going to hit, and it's going to hit the bottom line. So a lot of uncertainty out there. I wouldn't get hung up on the specifics of recession, no recession. It is already damaging the economy. The uncertainty is doing its part, and it's paralyzing businesses and households and government. And we're seeing that propagate throughout the economy, and right down to the fiscal side, you'll see revenues hurt and costs for operating costs and capital costs for the municipalities go up.
All right. Matti, we had just mentioned economic uncertainty. It seems to be the theme ever since the tariffs have hit. How can municipalities plan when we don't know exactly what Donald Trump is going to do next?
In some ways, this almost seems like it's the strategy, is to destabilize us. And this has absolutely hit our cities and our economy. When it comes to home building, you've heard earlier that home builders make decisions that are years into the future. When we make decisions about infrastructure, those are based on assumptions about how the economy is going to function, where people are going to want to go, and what services they're going to need. So the tariffs and the broader trade war has really introduced this moment of uncertainty. It's seized up our decision-making and our industries, and that's what's posing big problems. I think at this point, we need to be really hard-headed and look internally and use this as a moment to think about what is important to us, to try to push aside some of the extraneous investments that we've been making and really understand and use evidence to make decisions about what investments are going to deliver the best return on investment. Because we know now, especially in this uncertain environment, we can't do everything. We can't do it everywhere. We can't do it all at once. We're going to have to be much more precise and much more targeted in order to achieve the outcomes that our communities demand.
Mayor, there are boots on the ground, let's say. I want to get a sense of what's happening in St. Catharines, perhaps in the nearby communities as you're talking to other mayors and councillors because of these tariffs. What's the sense?
Well, it's interesting. We hear a lot of statistics, and I appreciate all the reports that have been put out. The anecdotal evidence that we're getting on the ground is pretty dire. I've had conversations with business owners in my community, not necessarily in the export industry. We know the damage that's being done to those who do the exports. And in Niagara, that's significant. That's, almost 70% of what we make is being exported across the river. But when you talk anecdotally to those other industries, something as simple as I had this conversation 2 months ago with a gentleman, his business hires 30 people during the spring, summer, fall to pave parking lots and driveways, and he wasn't hiring anybody. They had 0 commercial orders. They had a couple of driveways. He was taking care of those himself. That's the knock-on effect. And when I talk to my colleagues in other municipalities, it's the same issue. We're hearing from different business leaders that, listen, the investment just isn't there. The uncertainty, to Matti's point, the uncertainty might just be the actual reason for all of this because nobody wants to invest. And in a situation where nobody wants to invest, nobody wants to hire, and everybody starts looking at their books very carefully because they feel the recession coming. You know, we're in the middle of it now. Regardless of what the indicators might tell us today, we're in the middle of it, and as long as that uncertainty continues, it's probably not going to get better.
What's the challenge there as someone who's leading the community to see a lot of people who are quite fearful?
Well, I mean, the challenge, there's a couple. The biggest one that I find is, you know, for the last 6 to 8 months, all we've talked about is tariffs, and that's sucked the oxygen out of any room with municipal leaders because, you know, I have an infrastructure crisis. I have a housing crisis. I have a homelessness crisis. I have an opioid epidemic. I have a mental health crisis. But every conversation always comes back to tariffs, and that uncertainty is making it not impossible, but it's making it very difficult to have conversations about the investments that are needed in other areas when I don't know what's going to happen to my business community, which means I don't know what's going to happen to my residents, and I have to start making decisions about next year's property tax bill. We've been doing that now for several months. When all of this kicked off and we realized where the uncertainty was going, the first thing I said to my treasurer was, with your tax plan this year, what you're putting forward in the budget, identify cuts, because we may have to be taking another look at our municipal finances if things go sideways quickly. We haven't seen the indicators quite get to that, you know, ring the danger bell point yet, but we might.
I saw you nodding your head. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, what rings so true to me is the word fear. That this has brought fear all through our communities and our economy. People are worried about their jobs and their livelihoods and their businesses, and municipalities are worried about where they're going to have resources and what their futures are going to look like. And I think, you know, certainly in February, March, April, when this was really kicking off, there was a lot of panic, I would almost say, and now it seems like we're past the moment of panic and into the thinking through what are we actually going to do, and let's now get analytical, let's get systematic, let's put plans in place, but let's also look internally about how we can become more efficient and keep on what is important for us as Ontarians and as Canadians, and not lose sight of that because of these external pressures.
Tony, I want to talk a little geography. Of course, you know, St. Catharines, the area will feel it a little differently than, say, Toronto or Ottawa. Can you give us an idea of why the impacts would be different in those regions?
Well, Toronto is an example. Exports to the U.S., their manufacturing is large. But as a share of that economy, it shows resilience because it has a strong business services sector, financial services sector. And so it's not going to hit the GTA as much as it will smaller communities, which are heavily dependent on, say, manufacturing to a larger degree. So you're thinking about towns, including St. Catharines, what the mayor just talked to. And you look at Windsor, very, very dependent on trade with the U.S. You look at Hamilton, the steel industry, very important there. And they just don't have that buffer of other sectors. Ottawa, we know, the civil service, the public sector, that buffers the economy to these sort of cyclical winds. And so that's where you're seeing the differential impact. And largely the ones that are dependent on manufacturing in Ontario are going to be the harder hit communities.
All right. Matti, municipalities already find it challenging to build infrastructure. How does the current economic situation make things more difficult?
Well, if we rewind the clock in our memories even back to 2017, and we now look forward to pre-tariff world, the cost of construction had risen by about 50%. And in some sectors even higher. So, you know, we had already been facing cost pressures. We had all of the pressures through the pandemic. And now you layer on tariffs, which are just creating this additional layer of uncertainty. And municipalities are frontline. You're the frontline service providers. And you're bearing the brunt of, just like the mayor said, about infrastructure. Which types of infrastructure should you invest in? How do you balance between state of good repair and new investments with the uncertainty of how your communities are going to be impacted and how your economies might change? So again, I think in these moments where there is uncertainty, the key is to try to nail down as many variables as you can. What do you know for certain? What are the nice to haves and the need to haves? And then focus exclusively on what is the most important, make those priority lists, and then invest with confidence.
I want to go back to 2017. You were talking about the cost. Do we know what was the reasons for our spike in costs?
The costs of the resources have gone up. The cost of labor has skyrocketed. We've had labor shortages in parts of the construction industry. Some of the raw materials, like lumber during the pandemic, just absolutely went through the roof. And what you find with these cost spikes is they tend to go up they tend to stabilize but not necessarily come down. And so you're still seeing high prices. One of the things that might be an unintended consequence of this tariff and trade war is that you might be able to actually get better prices on some of your construction during this moment, because contractors are looking for work, and there's less pressure and there's less competition for jobs than there had been during the real go-go days, when there was a lot of building taking place. So you're seeing some price stabilization, but it's from a base that's already way higher than it was even just half a decade earlier.
Mayor, are we seeing that?
And so I would love to see some of those competitive prices. That would be fantastic. I'm glad Matti raised this, because I think that's been lost in a lot of this. The cost to construct infrastructure have risen drastically. I was the budget chair in St. Catharines when I was a councillor, and back in 2017, we started looking at infrastructure deficits that were doubling. And not because we had discovered any great new problem with our infrastructure, it was just simply the costs of every project were coming in significantly higher than our staff had been pricing 6 months previous. That's continued. When we talk about inflation in Canada over the last 10 years, construction inflation has been one of the single biggest problems we've faced as a municipality. My capital budget now is, I think, 2.5 or 3 times bigger than it was back in 2015 or 16. It's not because we've ramped up our infrastructure spending greatly, although we have. It's due to the rise in construction costs. And this is why, when the Premier made the announcement on Monday, we're going to increase by $1.6 billion, that's wonderful, the housing enabling infrastructure, but, reading through the Oxford report, and it says that, construction costs will raise by $1 billion. Well, okay, so that's actually, in real dollars, that's only a $600 million investment. And, obviously municipalities are always thankful for additional dollars from the province. But if it's just barely covering the additional costs, well, then that's not opening up new capacity to be able to build the infrastructure. And in this moment, when we are trying everything in the toolbox to try and get housing built and the infrastructure that comes along with that housing, every dollar is necessary, and ultimately it all falls back on the same people that have to pay the bill.
I'll get Tony and then I'll go back.
I would say, I think we're seeing the tide turn, and I think municipal governments, you're constrained. You don't have a lot of revenue tools. You should, but you don't. But we're seeing other levels of government step up. Maybe not enough, but it's starting. I think what you'll see with the Premier of Ontario, that's step one. The Carney government, they're talking about nation-building projects. They're going to benefit all of us. And we'll see what they decide, but they're covering the gamut of defense, mining, critical mining in particular, transportation, ports, a variety of infrastructure. So you're going to see money there. I think that is the right thing. It steps in the right direction. Not there yet, not going to prevent a recession now, because the timing on these things are always going to be such that they're going to happen a little later than we would like, but it's going to be definitely the right step and appropriately so.
Right.
This is a moment, I think, where we do also need to look inwards. Over the last number of years, we've become one of the highest cost jurisdictions to do construction. We are an expensive place to build things. In the transit sector, for example, there have been studies done out of New York University that benchmark us against countries all over the world. We are by far the most expensive, or at least in the upper tier. This can't continue, and you're seeing it across all the different areas of infrastructure, whether it's civil infrastructure, whether it's housing, costs which have skyrocketed. We've become an expensive place to do things, and it's not only because we have living labor wages and we have environmental standards, because we're being benchmarked to countries in Europe that have those exact same things in place, and we're still more expensive. I think in this moment, when we are under pressure, when there is fear, we also have to think about how we can do things differently. What are the different tools and techniques on the government side that we can streamline processes, that we can make things go faster, that we can become more efficient, and also encourage our private sector partners to bring their innovation to the table to try to bring down costs, because otherwise we're just not going to be able to build everything, the nation building projects and the state of good repair projects that we all desire.
I want to add one more point on that. The cross-current that's going on, there's a lot of cross-currents in the economy. It's not just the trade war. But we've seen a population surge, which created some of these pressures. And now we're seeing the government attempt to curb immigration, reduce the share of temporary residents. That's going to hurt the supply of labor. On the construction side, they're trying to tackle that balance that act. But we're going to see some of those pressures there subside in the next couple of years. That doesn't mean there's an infrastructure gap, but it gives us maybe a little room, a little more time to get it right.
Mayor, I want to talk a little bit, you had mentioned your budget, and I'm just curious, and you had given examples of roads and some projects. Are there projects in the city of St. Catharines that you're like, at the moment, we can't, as a municipality, do this right now?
Yeah, and I mean, we're a lower tier municipality, so we have control and responsibility over things like recreational facilities. And I mean, my community needs another pool. We know that. We have benchmarked ourselves against all other municipalities. We know how much recreational infrastructure we should have compared, or based on our population. We're not meeting that yet, but it's really hard to say to people that are losing their jobs. And I will point out, you know, we've seen about a 2.6% reduction in jobs in Niagara as a whole that extends across all. So that's 7,000 jobs in the region of Niagara. A large portion of that will be in my community. I can't turn to those folks and go, yeah, but we need a pool. That has to take a step back. It has to be on the back burner for now, because we also have roads and bridges that need to be maintained just to allow for the functionality of our economy. You know, so those are the kinds of value judgments we have to make right now, and it's difficult because you know that you're lagging behind, and frankly, some of your businesses are relying on you to attract new people to the community to be able to fill some of their jobs, because we do have segments where there are labor shortages still. I need to be able to provide a community that people are going to want to live in as well. If I'm not making the investments in recreation, that's one of the big levers that I have to actually pull. So it's a balancing act, and I would say, I mean, I've only been in this job for 3 years. I don't know if we've ever been in a situation like this before. It's complicated, and you know, I lean on my council. I think we have good heads around the table, and but it's a difficult stretch.
All right, Tony, we talked a little bit about the geography. I want to get a better understanding of the sectors that will be hardest hit. Give us a sort of a scope as to the ones who should be sort of bracing themselves.
Well, they're going to be the poster child, the ones that are being hit with the tariffs. So we know that it's a complicated tariff threat from the U.S., and it keeps changing, so it's always tough to keep up to the latest. But he's talking about tariffing all of our non-USMCA compliant, that's the North American Trade Deal, good, at 35%. It just got raised from 25%. But there is that component that's compliant with the North American Trade Deal that is going to be tariff-free. Then you've got other areas like copper now just got hit by 50%, steel and aluminum, 50%, irregardless of their compliance with North American Trade Deal. So you think about those, and that's the kind of the ones that are at the forefront of who's going to bear the brunt of this. So those sectors, and wherever they are across Canada and Ontario, we know where they are. We identified them a minute ago in manufacturing, but also the ones that are related to the primary industries. So it's manufacturing and the primary industries. You also worry about those sort of unintended consequences of higher costs for things like steel and aluminum on construction. That's what the mayor was talking about, and that's what we're already seeing, that they're worried about that cost going up, and that just makes it tougher for municipalities to meet their infrastructure needs. So those are kind of at the front. Then you say, if this broadens, and right now the contraction in the economy we've seen in the second quarter of this year is largely in those trade-dependent sectors, and the uncertainty is affecting broader than that. That's what Matti was talking about. But if it broadens to a deeper downturn that hits households and housing, then that becomes more of a classic recession driven by policy change that is going to be more widespread across sectors in the economy. Right now, we're seeing it largely contained, and we think it'll still stay that way, but there is the risk it could broaden.
I think we should be really clear about one thing. I mean, in many ways with tariffs, we're in the calm before the storm. There's been a lot of talk about the tariffs and reciprocal tariffs, but many of the goods in Canada are still covered by CUSMA. And so a lot, you know, the tariff bomb has not hit us yet. And if there's a renegotiation, which could start as early as 2026, that could be a real change in what we're experiencing. And I worry, you know, listening to the mayor talk, I worry that actually in many ways what we're looking at is a worsening quality of life because our municipalities just can't keep up. I mean, take my community. I live in Toronto. There are community centers you go to where there are buckets placed around the community center because the roof is leaking. A few months ago during the major heat wave, some of the pools had to close because it was over 40 degrees on the pool deck, and the staff couldn't work under those conditions. And I got a call from a journalist a couple of weeks ago who said, would you be willing to comment on a story about a bridge, a local bridge that is out of service right now, and the construction date, the targeted construction date on that bridge isn't until 2027. 2.5 years until they can get to fixing this bridge so that people can get across their community. And it turned out, actually, in case anyone is really wanting to be frightful, that that's on an evacuation route from one of the nuclear plants. So, I mean, this is what we're looking at in our communities. I mean, this is really real. That as you start to pull back and as we don't have the resources to invest in the infrastructure that the mayor was talking about, these are anecdotal stories that ladder up to a decline in our quality of life. And I think we're going to have to address both the cost of construction and also how we do it and how we prioritize which projects we're leading with.
Well, I will say, though, I think that the tariff issue is also bringing to a head a lot of the concerns that municipalities have been raising with the province and with the federal government for years now. You know, I come to these conferences on an annual basis, whether it's through AMO or FCM, and the conversation is always talking about the municipal fiscal framework, which is a very fancy way of saying how municipalities get revenue to build things and offer services. And the truth is that model doesn't work. Tariffs are really, really dragging that into the forefront now because, you know, as we deal with all of these other crises, with tariffs layered on top, I mean, municipal leaders have known this for a long time, but I think everybody else is coming to the realization, as Tony mentioned, the upper levels of government are starting to realize, oh, this is not how you can fund the level of government that's responsible for, what, 65% of the infrastructure, and we collect 9 cents of every tax dollar? Like, that's never made any sense. It didn't even make sense at Confederation. It really doesn't make sense now, and it hasn't changed since then. So if there's a silver lining in this, it's that the upper levels of government are starting to recognize that the people who do the heavy lifting need to actually have the dollars to do the heavy lifting. And I hope that comes out of it, but time will tell. I don't know how much time we have.
Well, I'll key off on a few points you raised there, but I think that the silver lining on this is also that we are tackling now and addressing issues that should have been dealt with for decades. Internal trade in Canada, diversifying our trade markets beyond the US. We're too many eggs in one basket, and you see how that's played out when it turns on us. And we haven't had comprehensive tax reform or a review of that in, 35, 40 years. Long overdue. The economy has changed. You think about how the digital economy, how the economy is basically different today. And we have tax codes that are not up to date, and we've struggled with it piecemeal. There needs to be a comprehensive review, including in that is the fiscal framework to address the sort of comments you're talking about. Not we need more studies. Well, unfortunately, in this case, these are going to be long-lasting and significant structural changes. I do think it needs a little thought. That doesn't mean we can't move quickly on some other fronts, but I think there's a two-pronged approach to this that would be required.
All right, well, this is a good segue because I want to talk about where do we go from here. And so, Tony, I'm going to stick with you. How can these sectors, the ones that you have mentioned, adapt during this uncertainty? Where are some opportunities here?
Well, I'll tell you right off the bat, the Canadian government does have a counter-tariff remission program. There's a big debate on whether we should have retaliated and how much, because the government recognizes tariffs are a tax on the domestic economy. And the U.S. doing this is really going to be paid for by a little bit. Right now, we see that it's mainly by corporations squeezing their margins. They're hesitant to raise prices in the U.S. Consumer prices have gone up, but also some of the exporters have reduced. But the idea is that Canada had to retaliate. They felt they did. They tried to be strategic and hitting those areas that would hurt the U.S. more than would hurt us. Think about, Kentucky bourbon, the one that was the poster child for it. You can buy Canadian whiskey and not buy U.S. Bourbon. You can maybe switch from orange juice from Florida to some other place. But in areas of manufacturing, we can't. We're tied into this integrated production system, especially in the auto sector, that's very efficient, works really well. It's been formulated over decades now. And so to just say, we put a tariff and now find a different supplier, and in the case of Canada, a different market to ship that widget, it's hard. It's a very specialized component that fits into that process. The government is in their tariff remission program is giving 6-month relief if you can't find an alternative supplier to the U.S. and try to find another market for those things. So that's recognition of that. That being said, I think there are other markets for areas that are more, I'll call them homogeneous, they're more standardized. Think about commodities like oil and wheat and things across Canada that you can ship to other parts of the world. So if the U.S. doesn't want it, they think they don't need us, I think they're wrong. They do need us. We need each other. We all benefit, mutually benefit from a proper free trade agreement. But we will find markets for those more homogeneous type products. The other ones that are more specific to a manufacturing facility that are processed in the U.S. may take time. But I think we're looking at that. Not us, but Canada is. So we diversifying our destination for our products is essential. And you can see it's going to be a long haul because we've been talking about this for decades. But we won't ever eliminate trade with the U.S. It's too big a market. But we should have a more diversified portfolio. Think about what I mentioned, Toronto being on aggregate not as hard hit because it has an economy that's much more diversified. And so our trade orientation should be as such. That's going to take time for some areas. But I think we're all recognizing that, and I think we're moving in that direction, and it's overdue.
I am curious. With these tariffs, there's a lot of, elbows up. We need to look out for ourselves, for our other provinces. But you had also mentioned calm before the storm. Is there a little bit of sort of the reason there's a bit of a delay is that perhaps this all goes away? Perhaps, we don't actually need to do all this. It seems great that we're all coming together and doing this, but do we really need to do that? I am curious, is there a bit of, or a bit of hesitation on sort of moving forward, or is this a good thing that we're doing this?
I think a lot of the strategy from our neighbors to the south towards us is to destabilize and to see how we respond. And I think in these moments, the key is to be calm and measured and firm, but not to overreact. And I think on this point, one thing I think is really important is that we don't fight a trade war by bringing in our own forms of protectionism. We need to be really careful. I know there's this elbows up and buy Canada, and there's talk about, we've seen contracts canceled or sole sourced. We need to be really careful. I mean, the flip side of sole sourcing a contract consistently over time or targeting Canadian firms is that you might end up with higher prices, less competition in the market, and over the longer term, higher prices, which then feeds into issues around our tax bases and our resources to be able to deliver all of the infrastructure that we need. And we should be clear as well that sometimes when we've done Buy Canadian, it hasn't always worked out all that well. That if you're talking about new supply chains on important projects where they haven't worked together before, that doesn't always go so well. I mean, we have the example of the Ottawa LRT, and I would just encourage you can see it in the Commission of Inquiry, where they talk about doing both a new project and bringing together new supply chains for a very big undertaking, and it did not go very well. And the taxpayers and residents of Ottawa, who ultimately what they wanted was a transit line, had years where it wasn't working, it had derailments, it had safety issues, and apparently it's working better now. But these are the types of things I think to fight a trade war by becoming internally protectionist is concerning. I think that doesn't mean we, doing business with our neighbors to the south, with the Americans, I think that, to be more elbows up there. But we also have, we're trying to find partners globally. So if we're cutting off contracts here and their access to our market, what do you think they're going to do to us? Those are the people who are working in your communities, who are looking for contracts to diversify their economy. So if we're making it harder for Europeans or the Japanese or the Koreans to have access to our markets, they're going to do the exact same thing back to us, and that's not going to end well. We're a small, relatively small population trading nation. We have to be very careful about how we go about being protectionist ourselves.
Yeah. I will say, from a political standpoint, I don't think this is going away. The impression that I've gotten, and I have the opportunity, I'm the co-chair of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, so I have a lot of interactions with American mayors. And I think what American politicians on both sides of the aisle are learning is that actually protectionism plays pretty well, and that you might be able to win an election with a protectionist agenda. I don't think it matters whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who wins the White House in a couple of years. I think the general bent is going in the direction of protectionism. It's going in the direction of tariffs. They're going to maintain those things because they think that's how they can win elections. And unless there are serious ramifications for American consumers, which we haven't seen yet, I think they're going to continue on in that direction. So to the point, I don't think we can afford to get more protectionist. I think we actually have to go in the opposite direction with everybody else in the world. I think we have to get back to our roots as a free trading nation. We have to identify new trade partners across the planet who we can enter into agreements that we know it's going to be a reciprocal situation, because there are partners out there in the world who will try and take advantage of whatever agreement we come into. We have to identify those partners. We know who they are already. And we have to start signing more robust free trade agreements to open up better lanes for our goods to be able to export. On the last point, I will just say, I think Buy Canadian this time around is actually working okay. And I hope, sincerely hope, that every federal and provincial politician who has been talking about breaking down interprovincial trade barriers actually means it this time. But I can't help but feel like I'm Charlie Brown and Lucy's holding the football. Because how many times, how many elections have we heard someone say, well, we need to improve the flow of goods across interprovincial barriers? We do. You know, in Niagara, we are a wine producing region. Best wine in the country. I don't care who is going to argue with me. And we have seen, you know, Ontario wines, Niagara wines, taking up more and more space on the shelves. And so that's an area where the targeted reciprocal tariffs, I think, are helping to a certain extent, and the Buy Canadian sentiment is helping. But it's still hard to get Niagara wines out of Ontario. You know, and even as we're hearing provincial leaders talk about making it easier, you're seeing, you know, one province slapping an additional tax on, you know, Alberta slapping a tax on British Columbian wine in the midst of all of this. And I just look, okay, so we were just all talking then. We need some actual movement. You know, it's when you see the statistics that get quoted about how much our national GDP could increase if we just made it easier to get goods across provincial barriers, like that's infuriating. You know, because I have businesses who could be taking advantage of that today, right now, increasing their revenue, being able to, you know, maintain the employment of the people who are currently working for them, and that falls by the wayside because we can't get to that place. And I will also give credit to a couple of premiers, you know, Premier Houston in Nova Scotia and Premier Canoe and Premier Ford. Like, they seem to be on the right track, but we need it to happen faster. Right. You know, we can't just wait for it to happen. We have to take those steps and make tough decisions.
All right,
I'll just key off on that first. Internal free trade is appropriate, absolutely, but it isn't just trading goods, it's having labor mobility. So you get your accreditation for your credentials in one province are applicable in another. And it's not a panacea. There's going to be adjustment even with this, and it's going to take time, but it is the right thing to do. On the permanency of sort of protectionism, we think that's going to be the case. We think that there will be a renegotiation of the USMCA, the North American trade deal. I don't think it has to wait till next year. Next year, there's a requirement that all parties either sign, we're going to review it, renew it, or not. I think President Trump is indicating quite clearly it's going to happen sooner. But we anticipate that there will be ongoing tariffs even after the negotiation by the U.S. on products from Canada, particularly those steel, aluminum, and agricultural products that are quite irritating to the U.S. Now, they cite those under national security provisions. I think what we're going to see is our defense strategy, which is now looking to target defense spending as a share of the economy to 5% by 2035, is going to take that same approach. And I think it's appropriate. I've been talking about this for quite a while. You know, you want to have free trade that allocates goods and services most efficiently, but there's some things you need to do and have national security on. And you can define that broadly to include everything from energy to food security, critical minerals, down that stretch. And that's where we can favor our Canadian companies to build up some economies of scale. I'm not talking about building tanks and jet fighters. We don't have that capacity. Our own needs are never going to be enough to satisfy that. But you think about the warfare and potential warfare in the 21st century is very different. You're talking about drones, cyber warfare, a variety of things where we can actually be a leader. And we can not only create a domestic industry, but supply maybe other countries, including the U.S., with our own specialized products and services in that arena. So all that being said, yes, there will be I think a permanent higher protectionism. When you put tariffs on, as history has shown, they take a long time to come off. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what stripe of the government.
Okay.
Yeah, coming out of this part of our conversation, one thing that occurs to me, I want to see, I think what we need is our Canadian companies to compete and to be the most competitive and to win because they're the best and because people want to use their products and their services. That's how our economy will grow. That's how we're going to sell services, not just to the Americans but overseas. And again, that's why I come back to this idea of protectionism, that I think if we start protecting certain industries, you see what happens. The pricing might not be as good, and the innovation, their pressure to innovate might not be as much. And so I think, especially at the municipal side, politically, there will be a lot of pressure to start giving contracts to local, provincial, and national firms. I think, obviously, breaking down trade barriers can make our industries more efficient and make them more competitive. But I do think that idea of competition is really important, because if we're limiting the pool, we're a relatively small country, and we tend towards oligopolies. And when and you can think of, pick your favorite industry where there's 3 or 4 companies and you feel like you're getting gouged by the day. And that will be the types of procurement environments you're in. And the costs are going to go up and the service quality is going to go down. So I think we really need to keep focused on encouraging competition in our market, encouraging working with countries that we share agreements with, allowing their firms to compete here, but on the provision that our firms can compete vigorously in their markets for jobs as well.
Can I jump in? There's one thing, we've talked a little bit about USMCA and the fact that it needs to be renegotiated, and Matti's contention that could be the actual issue. The wrinkle I'll throw into the discussion, we're assuming that we renegotiate it and then they follow it. And this is, does anybody have that sense of stability? And when we started all of this, they were ignoring the fact that there was a free trade agreement, and then there was, obviously, now we're going to exempt those. But so we get down the path, we renegotiate it, and we all just assume that the current administration is going to say, oh, well, but I mean, it's USMCA exempt, so we won't touch that. This is where that uncertainty comes from, and this is why I say, I think it is an elbows up strategy to our friends still, I hope, down south, but we have to be looking to the rest of the world, and we have to be pushing that trade diversification angle as hard as we possibly can, because it is so unpredictable what could happen, renegotiated USMCA or not.
All right. I do want to mention, when we're talking about defense, there's some hope. There's some contracts out there. I know there's potential for some ships being built in Port Weller area. There are some ballistic steel in Brampton. There's some stuff there, but I know you wanted to add, Tony.
I just wanted to talk about the USMCA for a moment longer. That's okay. We've always thought that this was a play to get a better deal. Of course, President Trump is looking at trade and a lot of non-trade related objectives in all of this tariff talk. But we were heartened by his actually allowing USMCA compliant free imports from Canada to go tariff-free. Mm-hmm. That gave us confidence that he's still going to abide by a North American trade deal. I don't know what it'll look like, but it was better than before when it was across-the-board tariffs on everything regardless of the North American. That was an abrogation of the deal and basically was not what we had expected. But it's changed since then. So we're hopeful that this is going to lead to a renegotiated deal. You're right. He changes his mind. Trump does. How often? Quite often. And we don't, but we are heartened by that, and we think that there will be a deal. And we're looking for something middle of next year, but it'll continue to have some protectionist elements to it on an ongoing basis.
All right, I'm going to move away from Donald Trump. I'll come back to the White House, don't worry.
I was going to jump in on defense if you wanted
Let's
to.
talk.
Because you talked about Port Weller, and I will just point out Port Weller in the beautiful city of St. Catharines. Mm-hmm. But it raises an interesting and important point. We've known that there are investments. I mean, outside of the NATO commitments, we've known that there are investments that needed to be made on defense for a number of years. I've been in office now for 3 years. I've worked with my friends at Ontario Shipyards for 3 years. And I mean, my message to our federal colleagues is, folks, we actually have to start doing these things. Yeah. To your point about shipbuilding, it can take place in Canada. We do have the industry. We need to make the decision to make the investments. And obviously, I'm biased. I would love to see a lot of those contracts come to the folks in Port Weller. We have a long manufacturing history in St. Catharines. But ultimately, we just need to build them. Like the Kingston class of ships is not going to build itself. And this is where, similar to interprovincial trade, we talk a lot about things. But the time for talk is done. And it has to be done for a myriad of reasons, whether it's the betterment of employment situations for our residents or it's the defense of the country. We have to stop talking about things and actually make decisions.
All right. We've got about 20 minutes left. I think I'm only one page in here, so I've got a lot more questions for you guys. Matti, I'm going to stick with you for a little bit. Other levels of government are talking about major infrastructure projects. Can you break down a few highlights of some of these projects, and should municipalities be encouraged by these moves?
So we are in a moment of nation-building infrastructure. I think that's captured the public imagination and the policy sphere as well. We still, at the federal level, don't quite know exactly what the specific projects are yet. At the provincial level, we've heard announcements and proposals for very big projects. I would say it's a mixed bag, to be fair. And I think, big sigh from the mayor. I mean, folks in this room, like, let's just pick one project. The tunnel under the 401, the project that seems like it will never go away. Think about the scale of that. I mean, that's $100 billion or somewhere in that neighborhood. Imagine how much of your own infrastructure. That's all that, and it's the province of Ontario project. It's 50 kilometers of highway in a province as big as ours. We're going to spend $100 billion. How much infrastructure in your own communities could be resolved if that money was spent in different ways? So it's nice to know my political colleague, the mayor, is not the only one who can get applause in this room.
Just to confirm, that was the sigh?
But I guess what I'm getting at then is there will be all sorts of people that take this idea of nation building and try to glue their own interests to it. Whether it's home builders looking for subsidies, whether it's industries looking for contracts, or whether it's different politicians looking to make their name or get reelected. And I think the key in this moment now is that we really use evidence and be smart, because our resources, they were never unlimited, and they are certainly scarce now. We just can't afford to be wasting money on projects that are not going to deliver on their promise. And I think we have to be much more laser focused. And municipalities, when you start hearing about nation building, that both should be exciting, but also send a bit of a shudder down your spine, that it also means you're not going to be getting necessarily as much money for the boring state of good repair, like the bridge replacement or like fixing the roof on the arena. The things that are kind of boring till they're broken and a bit out of sight, out of mind to the more higher orders of government, but are still really important to your day-to-day operations and to the quality of life of your constituents.
So I also have the opportunity to sit with the Ontario Big City Mayors, and we've been having the conversation. We had our meeting earlier this month, and we're talking about what priorities we might want to put forward towards the provincial government in terms of nation-building projects. And a few ideas were tossed around. One that stuck with me, and I haven't stopped thinking about it, in a conversation with Mayor Josh Morgan from London and Mayor Brian Patterson from Kingston, about the need for a much more robust rail transit system in Southern Ontario. And I've always felt, we've done a lot of highway reconstruction work in the last number of years, and I've always felt that it's a bit of a missed opportunity. You can't build highway lanes to try and fix congestion. It doesn't work. We know this from the 20s in New York City all the way through to the 20s now in Toronto. The reality is we need a more robust public transit system, and rail is one of those options that people seem to actually like. If you go to almost any other place in the world, this isn't even a debate. I've had the benefit, I've lived in Europe, I've lived in Asia, and rail and public transit is just a way of life, and people like it. We could be looking at a much more, like I said, a robust GO network that spans across Southern Ontario, that runs from Ottawa to Windsor and down to Niagara Falls and connects all of the places in between with more regular service. That's the sort of project that has multiple spin-offs. It's not just good for quality of life. It improves the economic prospects for people. It allows them to live in one municipality where the cost of living is less expensive, but work in another at a far more reasonable rate. There are so many ways that something like that could benefit the entirety of, the province of Ontario. And I mean, when I talk about that corridor, we're talking about what, 40% of the Canadian population lives in that area? I mean, anything you can do to improve the lot of 40% of your population, you should probably take that step.
All right. Matti, Tony was mentioning, we have steel, we have aluminum, we have a robust manufacturing sector. I want to talk, you mentioned supply chain. What can we do to establish a robust supply chain for infrastructure here?
I think we need to let our firms compete. We need to have a pipeline of projects that's predictable. That's always been an issue in the infrastructure space, that when the tap gets turned on and then it gets turned off, companies can't plan, and they lose. It's not just that they lose people, they lose momentum, and they lose relationships. And I mentioned the Ottawa LRT project earlier, and it's really striking when you look, when someone goes and actually does like a very close audit and examination of what happened, and you see that the relationship part was so important, and that companies trying to build big things under a time pressure and budget pressure with new relationships is really challenging. And so I think the most important thing is to have a long-term pipeline that shows confidence that there's going to be projects over the long term, and then encouraging competition and making sure that we're not just giving contracts to the same old over and over again. That also leads to the status quo, and it leads to us having some of the highest contracting costs, and also, you probably experience it in your own communities about projects being late and over budget. So I think that there are strategies that we can follow that will help deliver these projects better, but yeah, it's going to require a lot more long-term thinking about how we go about it.
In terms of long-term, Tony, I want to get a better understanding. I get the sense that this is the case, but what's happening between Trump and Canada? Is this a bit of a wake-up call for us to sort of get our house in order?
Well, I don't think it's just Trump in Canada. It's Trump in the whole world. But yes, it is a wake-up call at the same time. We have put all our eggs in one basket with the U.S. The free trade agreement we had with them in the late 80s, I think, had some faults in it. But we did benefit by it up until the past, say, 5 years, 10 years. And now we're seeing the dark side of it. And so if it's a wake-up call, it's just not Trump Canada. He's had all these thoughts about Canada. He says he doesn't need us, but he covets us. So I think we do have something he wants. And I think we should have a fair deal to provide that, rather than, I won't even use the words that Trump has used about Canada, because I won't go there, I won't validate it. We are an independent sovereign nation, and we're going to continue to do so, and that's just where I stand.
All right. Mayor, you had mentioned working with colleagues in the Great Lakes Basin. I want to bring up the White House. Does the White House have something against St. Catharines? You can imagine what I'm alluding to, but
if the White House has something against St. Catharines, they have something against Montreal as well. The mayor of Montreal and I were slated to meet with our Great Lakes colleagues and with members of the administration. This is back in March, and kind of unceremoniously the day before, I was standing in the Rayburn building in the Senate with the CEO of the Cities Initiative, and he came over to me and said, just letting you know, we just got notification you and Mayor Plante won't be able to be in the room. They've said your invitation has been rescinded and they told us we didn't follow State Department protocols. We've been doing this for a number of years. We followed all the same protocols. It was a little bit, it wasn't out of left field. I have to be honest. I questioned whether they were ever going to let us in. So that's fine. We work with some really good American mayors, Republican and Democrat, who have taken our side in all of this. I've signed letters with a Republican mayor from Portage, Indiana, Mayor Bonta, where he says the blanket tariffs that we were originally facing are going to damage the American economy as well.
Right.
And when I talk to my American colleagues, the mayor of Milwaukee and I were having a discussion. He talked about how they had an affordable housing building plan that they were going to move forward with, and now the prices of everything were going up, and they no longer believed they were going to be able to hit their targets to build affordable housing in Milwaukee. I mean, when I talk to folks, in Western New York, which gets more snow than a lot of parts of Ontario, I mean, where does the salt come from? Well, it comes from Goderich. And there were other trade policies that were ongoing where the Trump administration wanted to look at $1 million port calls for every foreign-built vessel. And municipalities across Western New York were saying, what are you doing? You're going to destroy us. We won't even be able to afford the salt to put down on our roads. Our American colleagues at the municipal level understand it. And so they've been really good allies for us. We may not have a friend in the White House right now, but municipally, I think the work that my organization has done, that AMO has done, that FCM has done in fostering those cross-border relationships with municipal officials, I think is going a long way. And I had mentioned earlier in the conversation, American consumers aren't really feeling it yet. They will. They have to. We know that business in America is very much trying to hold back the ramifications of these decisions right now, but eventually the dam breaks and you either close the doors or you raise your prices. When that happens, there's a bunch of municipal officials and also some congresspeople and some senators on both sides of the aisle who we've been in their ear. That's why we go to Great Lakes Day on Capitol Hill. That's why FCM sends delegations. That's why AMO reps are speaking to Congress of Mayor reps in the US, so that they know when that dam bursts, listen, this is how you fix it. And it's to try and reverse some of these tariffs because it's hurting American communities in similar ways to how it's hurting Canadian communities. As for the White House, I make the assumption I won't even be on the guest list next year.
I was going to ask, where you go?
I will go back to Capitol Hill though, because I think the work we're doing is valuable. You always get questioned as a mayor. Your residents will always say, "Well, I mean, you're not in the global affairs department. Why are you doing this work?" Well, because it's relationships. And if I can establish a relationship with a Republican mayor who's in the ear of members of this administration, maybe that moves the needle. I'll give one anecdote from that trip. We were in a meeting with Senator Duckworth, who is a Democratic senator, but she carries a significant amount of sway on Capitol Hill. And we had our meeting with her and her staff. We gave some statistics. About an hour and a half later, we were sitting in a lunch where she was speaking, and she was repeating the same statistics we had given her. This was novel information. She didn't understand the economic impact on a couple of the border states, and we were able to provide that information. That's why that work is important, because Senator Duckworth is going to cast votes in the Senate that are going to impact our trade.
Can I follow up on that? And I'm just curious, you're the boots on the ground for us. So, and I was thinking St. Catharines, but also the White House. There's all this uncertainty and confusion. Here in early spring, when our eyes are glued to the screen to see what tariffs, how is this going to impact us, you say they understand the consequences as the lawmakers that you're working with, but do they understand what their president is doing? Are they also confused as to why this is all happening and why we're doing tariffs? Are they kind of looking at you like, I'm sorry?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. And I mean, again, even Republicans, you've got some of the fire breathers in the Senate who, are the ones on TV defending all of this and talking about, all of the rhetoric, using the same rhetoric as the president. But most of them behind closed doors are not speaking like that. And when we were talking to members of Congress, it definitely was a different conversation. Congressmen and women in Western New York who, border my region, Canadians are friends. When we all go to Bills games together and we all cheer for the same hockey teams, and they come across to visit wine country and we go across to watch sports. It's a pretty symbiotic relationship, and so it's not just another country to them; it's their neighbors to the immediate west, and I think it makes a dent.
All right, we have about 7 minutes left. A couple questions left. Tony, when we look into the future. Where do you see opportunities for economic resilience? We had mentioned resilience off the top. Where's that opportunity?
Well, first, I think this too shall pass. Even if we get permanent tariffs, I think it will pass. I think our relationship with the U.S. has been tarnished, and we now have had that wake-up call, and we are looking broader. But I think we will get through this, and we will still trade with them. You can't avoid it. They're a big market. But we are diversifying. And I also want to add a few other things. Think about the resilience. You talked about resilience. And if we build up some more freer trade internal, diversifying our trade with other partners, but building up a defense industry and have that capacity in-house and having some national security homegrown. But I'll also talk about climate resilience. The U.S. southern regions are really affected by heat, flooding, and a variety of extreme weather events. Guess where there's going to be a climate refuge? The Great Lakes. If we take care of our Great Lakes, we could see a renaissance here, and that is really hopeful for the long term.
All right. Matti, we talked about nation-building projects, removing provincial trade barriers, establishing cross-country energy grids. There's an excitement, I imagine, for someone whose whole world revolves around infrastructure. Will we emerge from this with better infrastructure?
I have both excitement and some degree of trepidation, because the excitement, we know we've needed nation-building infrastructure for a long time. We've kind of let that slip for a matter of decades and fallen behind. But my trepidation comes from the picking of the projects. I really worry that that if we use this moment to build the right things, we set ourselves on a more competitive, cleaner, greener, more inclusive path. But if we don't, if the politics of this moment ends up with the same old types of projects that have been on, kicked around for years, we're going to end up broke. We're going to end up with projects that don't make sense. They're going to soil the environment. They might ruin our relationships with Indigenous communities. So really, we have to, and Indigenous nations. So we really have to be hard-headed, I think, at this moment. Not just get wrapped up in the enthusiasm of nation building, which I understand in this moment. I mean, I feel it as well. And to the mayor's comments, like for me as a resident and as a Canadian, it gives me hope when our officials and leaders are down in the States fighting for us. Like I have to say, when I hear about you being there, or I see Premier Ford on TV, that is important. I think that does speak, it both speaks to the Americans, but it speaks to us too, that we're not just rolling over and giving up. But I think then we have to follow that up with our own, with controlling what we can control, which is picking good projects, being expert in using the skills that we have to deliver them well. I mean, we can't have a repeat of some of the way we've been delivering past projects where they're so expensive, late, over budget, and everyone's suing each other at the end. We can't do that anymore. So, I think now is the moment where, and I think maybe to some of the comments Tony made earlier, this is a hinge point where I think we can start to, it's bad how we got here, but we can use it to our advantage to think differently and deliver, pick the right projects and deliver them well.
All right, so we've got just over 3 minutes left. One question to all of you. I'm going to get you going down the line. We'll start with Tony first. Your advice to municipalities on how to navigate these murky waters.
Well, one thing that I have mentioned when we've worked with AMO all year on this, and that tariff remission program I talked about, municipalities are eligible. If you are strapped, you can't get a non-US supplier, you have until the middle of October, anything you import from the US can get tariff remission from the Canadian government on steel, on aluminum, for national security provisions, public safety, public health, things of that nature. And I would say, look at that. Now, even if you import that stuff, doesn't mean you have to actually submit a claim. You have 2 years to submit a claim. So definitely investigate that. I would say that keep the talk up. Use the work we've done that says that you will be hit by this. No matter how the ultimate trade war and damages the economy, it is hurting the economy. The uncertainty alone is where a lot of the impact is. And make your voices loud and clear. And I think senior levels of government and citizens are listening. So I think that that's what I would recommend, and I know we're going to get through this.
Mayor?
I think the most important in my mind is, recognize the difference between the nice-to-haves and the must-haves.
Yeah.
But expand the definition of must-have, because sometimes we think, must-have means we have to repave that road. Okay, we also have to invest in public transit so that the next iteration of that road doesn't need to be over-engineered to accommodate 30% more traffic volume. If we can build out robust public transit systems, then all of a sudden our engineering costs, our project costs go down now and in the future. So recognize that must-haves are not the same in 2025 as they were in 1985 or 1965. We need to expand our minds about what must-have is. And we can see examples of that in other jurisdictions in other parts of the world. Look to Asia, look to Europe, look to those places that have the things that we all travel to go and see and experience and then come back home and think, I wish we had that here. Those are probably must-haves in the current climate.
Matti, you get the last word?
Can I say what he said?
I agree with that too. I'd say the same thing.
I mean, seriously, I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is a moment of transformation. We can grasp it, we can think differently, and I think we can end up coming through this with communities especially focused on affordability. I mean, there are people in our communities that are really hurting, and I think every focus, every lens should be through that, looking at how do we make things more affordable, how do we make our communities more livable and resilient.
Thank you so much. This was really, really good. Thank you.